I now call Daniel Johnson. Around 8 minutes, please. Mr Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Mental health and debt all too often go hand in hand and lead to absolutely disastrous social consequences, both for people immediately affected but for wider society. So therefore, the need to legislate in this area is clear, and is why Scottish Labour is broadly supportive of this bill and will be supporting it at stage 1 in terms of the general principles. However, I think it is important to note that we have concerns about the mechanisms by which people will trigger such a moratorium, the threshold at which it may be obtained, and thirdly, the protections that are afforded to those that choose to do so. But overall, and perhaps more importantly, I have concerns about the approach taken by the government in this bill. Essentially, legislating for an approach, but leaving the detail in all of these matters that I've just set out to be detailed in secondary legislation, therefore denying us the possibility of scrutinising them here today. And I think that is problematic. But this is an important area because we know that poor mental health go hand in hand with money problems. I think that is self-evident. And indeed, we know that people with mental health problems are 3.5 times more likely to be in debt. And that leads to a cascading situation where one in turn impacts the other, leaving our society and families devastated along the way. And that is all the more so as we are in the middle of a cost of living crisis, where family bills are going up, and those pressures mount. And it's why it is important, and we welcome the intent and the provisions such as they are set out. But first of all, I think I would like to just ask the question around the mechanisms, because by definition, the people we are talking about lack capacity. The people we are talking about are in the most deep of mental health crises, as set out in the policy memorandum and the mental health moratorium working group. And we have to ask ourselves whether they actually have the capacity or even the physical means. I will just take the intervention in a second to do so. I have the Royal Edinburgh Hospital in my constituency. I am contacted by people there. Very often, it is quite far down the line that they even have the means of communication to do so. And if those are the people that we are talking about, I would just question whether or not they have the capacity, but actually, as I say, also the physical means to take out such a moratorium. Very happy to give way.
Stephen Kerr.
Thank you to Daniel Johnson. Does he agree, though, at the end of this process, of this legislation, that people in Scotland in the distressing circumstances which we are outlining ought to be no less protected than people living in England and Wales? Surely that is the threshold at which we should be judging the detail of the bill around the moratorium.
Daniel Johnson.
I think Mr Kerr makes a valid point, that we need to, if we are approaching this legislation, ensuring that we are doing the most that we can. And if there are examples elsewhere, and particularly close at home, we should be looking at what we can do so. Indeed, I think we need to be questioning whether or not, if legislation is not going as far as the temporary provisions that we enacted recently during COVID, I think we need to ask ourselves whether this bill goes far enough. But I think the point I was just touching on about the capacity also leads on to the threshold point, because we don't have clarity. And while I understand that the government will publish draft regulations before stage 3, it's very hard to understand precisely what group of people this will apply to. As we look at the proposals from the Mental Health Moratorium Working Group, their suggestion is those undergoing compulsory treatment orders. In other words, in colloquial terms, those who are essentially sectioned. That's an extraordinarily high threshold. As we all know, that it's only people in the most severe forms, most acute forms of mental health distress, those who are likely to do harm to themselves and others, will find themselves in that situation. Now, I understand, and indeed I agree with what the Minister was saying about the need to find a balance, but I would suggest that that threshold is too high. By the same token, I do understand that happy to give way.
Brian Whittle.
Very grateful, Mr Johnson, for giving way. Would you also recognise then, and if we take it outside of that criteria, which I think most of us would agree with, there's an issue of resource that has to be addressed there?
Daniel Johnson.
This was the very point I was coming to. Because while I think abroad, just essentially those undergoing mental health treatment would be far too low, that would for example, include me as somebody undergoing ongoing mental health treatment, my concern actually is not so much that people with ADHD or autistic spectrum disorder might not need this, but actually the fact that many of those people who find themselves in those situations where their conditions are leading to dire financial situations quite simply can't access the resource, the help, the clinicians, as Mr Whittle is alluding to, who might be able to provide them with the diagnosis and the help they need. So I think we do need to look at what the criteria is. I think it needs to be tightly drawn up, but we also need to look at the access to the people that might well end up as gatekeepers. I would commend the committee for their work. I think their suggestions about other criteria are well made, such as those used in England and Wales for the breathing space. I think also, and while I take the comments of the convener as she made them about the stigmatising nature of the terminology, but the severely mentally impaired category from council tax is clearly a workable one, and I would ask why we're not using it. We do need to ask ourselves also how the moratorium will work in practice. We need to understand what protections and provisions it will take. Will it include the pause of enforcement actions? Will it pause contact from creditors? Will it freeze interest and charges on debts? I think questions such as car payments and car loans, which are the forms of debt so many people will have been entering into prior to the point of mental health crisis, these are the sorts of questions that need to be answered, and quite simply, we don't. But I think there is, as Mr Kerr alluded to, a risk that we may legislate for protections that are currently less than those available in Scotland on a temporary basis, or less than those in England and Wales. But moreover, I have severe concerns about the nature of this bill indeed. As I was looking at the bill itself in preparation for this, first of all, I was struck by the lack of specificity. We don't have any of these points about the mechanisms, thresholds or protections set out here, or even in principle. But when you look at Section 1, subsection 3, and you look at what the scope of regulations that can be brought forward by ministers, I have to say I am quite concerned. So in subsection 3, it states that regulations may, under this section, may make different provision for different purposes, may modify any enactment, and include incidental, supplementary, consequential, transitional, transitory or saving provision. That is extraordinary scope. That essentially enables ministers, albeit with a tenuous link to this bill, make changes to any act of this Parliament and do so for different purposes. I mean, I just find this quite concerning. To not even have the guide rails of principles, of criteria, to guide what those provisions may be made under, I think this is quite concerning. And I think we need to guard against this sort of legislation, which seems to be coming forward more frequently from this government. Because after all, and while I take the points being made by the government about the need to get this right, I would argue it's important to get those details right before you publish a bill, before it is put in front of Parliament, because that is what this place is for. Because, as was pointed out by in one of the previous interventions, there can be unintended consequences. Thresholds around mental health criteria, around issues such as debt, quite often have impacts that cannot be foreseen. And it's precisely for those reasons that we have Parliament, so we can test those, so that we can amend them. And we know, quite simply, that secondary legislation does not afford Parliament the same benefits in terms of interrogating legislation and critically amending it, let alone taking evidence that primary legislation does. Would it not have been better to have those things published and properly scrutinised by the committee in this Stage 1 report, rather than waiting till after the event? So can I just say that while we absolutely commend the intent of this, the broad purposes of this bill, I think, more importantly, I have huge concerns about this in terms of a way of legislating, and indeed whether or not it leaves open a wide open door for governments that may not have the benign intent that this one claims to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Johnson.